Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Jordan at Afterburner Automation, and today we're going to be going over the concept of variables. By the end of this course, you should understand the basic concepts behind variables, as well as the different types available in A360. We'll also go over the predefined variables that come with the RPA workspace and global values that are stored in the control room itself. Let's get started. So let's start by asking, what are variables? If you took my Citizen Developer Learning track, you probably already have a pretty good idea, but the basic concept is that a variable is a container that holds data that can vary or change. That's why they're called variables in the first place, since the contents of them are variable. These containers have names so that you can tell them apart, and in computer science, they'll typically also have a type to them, meaning that they can only hold a certain type of data, like text or numbers. One of the coolest things about variables is that they can be used and changed throughout your code. For instance, in the Citizen Developer Learning track, one of the first bots we built asked for your name, and when you typed it into the prompt, it displayed a message box saying, "Hello," and the name you just entered. What's going on behind the scenes is that when you type your name into the prompt, it's being put into a variable that we'll call name here. I've put the word name inside of $signs because that's how you can tell variables apart from actual text in A360. But in other areas of computer science, there are different ways to tell text apart from variable names. Anyway, after you type in your name and it gets stored in the name variable, we use a message box command where the message is, "Hello, name variable." When the message box command actually does its job at runtime, it finds the name variable and replaces our call to the name variable with whatever's actually held inside of it at that time. So instead of hello name variable, it'll say hello Jordan. But let's say that we copied those two lines of code, the prompt and the message box, and repeated them right after the original two lines. After the bot says hello Jordan, it'll show us another prompt asking for a name again. Let's say this time I type in Rachel. Our name variable already has Jordan stored in it, so the new value that we have gets assigned to the name variable and overwrites Jordan. Even though we have the exact same message box code as the second line of code, this time it'll say hello Rachel instead of hello Jordan, because there's something different inside of the name variable at this point in time. This is one of the biggest things to remember about variables. Since the data inside of them can be changed throughout your code, it's important to think about variables at certain points in time. If I were to look at the message boxes on line 2 and 4, I would have no idea what would be inside of the name variable unless I looked at what's happening before those lines of code. Also, it can be pretty hard to track what's going on with a variable just by looking at code, so sometimes it's necessary to put a message box at different points in your code that'll print out the variable so you can see how it's changing. There's also a debug mode next to the run button that allows you to set points where your bot will pause so you can look at different variables. But I'll be going over that in more detail in the Master Developer Learning track, so we can move past that for now, but feel free to experiment with it if you'd like. As I mentioned earlier, in computer science, variables typically have a type, meaning that they can only hold certain types of data. In A360, right now, there are 13 types of variables, and I'll go over each of them now so that you know what you're getting into. The first, and by far most common type of variable, is the string variable, which is just another way to say that they hold text. You may wonder why they didn't just call this type of variable a text variable, but in computer science, there's a type of variable called a char, or character, that holds a single character, like A or 1 or the ampersand symbol. When someone made a new type of variable to hold text, it was built as a string of characters, and the name stuck. Anyway, string variables are pretty self-explanatory, but one thing that can be confusing is that strings can hold numbers, even though the next type we're going to talk about is specifically for numbers. The way to think about this is that strings are meant to be used in text fields or logging to files. So if a string variable has the sentence, "I am 36 years old," then the numbers in that variable are treated as text or strings, and not as number type variables. That brings us to the next variable type, which is the number variable. Number variables are used for doing math in your code, and so they can only hold numerical digits, decimals, and the negative symbol. Some of the commands we'll be going over later in this track will show you how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide number variables using number commands. The trick to these is that number variables can't be used like strings, in that they can't be put into text fields or logged to files without first converting them to strings. We actually did this a few times with our loop counter variables in the Citizen Developer Learning track, but I'll be going into a lot more detail on how that works in the String and Number 201 courses in this track. The next variable type, called a Boolean, is the last of the three most common variable types, and it holds true or false and nothing else. These types of variables are typically used with if commands, either by checking if something is true or false, or by setting the Boolean variable to true or false based on the if statement. Booleans can also be converted to strings so that you can use them as text if need be, and I'll show you how to do that in Boolean 201. The next type of variable I want to talk about is the datetime variable. This type holds a date, a time, and a time zone, and one of the really cool things about it is that A360 has all kinds of ways that you can format these variables and put them into a string. So if you have a datetime variable showing today's date and time in your time zone, you can easily convert it to UTC time, or show just the month and day. I'll go over all the different ways you can manipulate datetime variables in Datetime 301 in the Advanced Developer Learning track, because that can get a bit complicated without the knowledge you're going to get from this track. The next type is a relatively simple variable type called file. File type variables can hold desktop files, control room files, or even desktop folders. Typically, you won't be using this variable type too often because it can be unnecessary, but I'll show you how to use them in the File 102 course later in this track. Next up, we have the window type variable, which is used to hold application windows or web browser tabs. We briefly touched on this in the Browser 101 course in the Citizen Developer track, but a window variable holds all of the details about a specific window that's open on your machine, and that can be used to check the status of the window, minimize or maximize it, or close it down, among other things. Window variables start out pretty simple, but can get a little complicated, so we'll start working with them in this track, but we'll look at them again in the Advanced Developer track. Another interesting variable type is the credential variable. Again, I've mentioned this one before, but basically a credential variable is intended to be a secure way to store passwords in A360. This type of variable is a bit different from the others because in general it's set up ahead of time by your control room administrator or security team, who loads the password into what's called the credential vault. Then, in your code, you can choose which password to put in the credential variable and use it with password fields. The really cool part about this setup is that at no point will you be able to actually see the password in the variable itself. The credential vault keeps the password secure so that you can't log it to a file or put it in a message box, but you can still use it to access applications. We'll go over the details of that later on in this track in the Credential 201 course. Next, we have the session variable, which we talked about a bit in the Excel Basic 101 course. Session variables are specifically used to identify different sessions that you start with Excel, DLL, and Terminal emulator packages. In the Excel Basic course, I showed you how you can give each session its own custom name by just typing it into the command, but session variables can also be created and selected to serve the same purpose. We'll go into detail on that throughout this track in a number of different courses. The last of the simple variable types is the form variable, which is specifically designed to be used with the interactive forms package. We haven't gone over interactive forms yet, but they're kind of like a much more advanced version of the prompt package. The thing is, when you use an interactive form command in your code, you have to reference the form you want to manipulate. To do that, you have to have already set up the form variable to store the specific form you want to use. That's a really simplified way to explain how those work, but let's leave it at that until we go over it in the Advanced Developer Learning track. The next four variable types are a bit different from the others we've gone over so far, which I call simple variables. These next types are what I call compound variable types, because while the simple variable types hold one piece of data at a time, these compound types hold multiple pieces of data in one form or another. That might seem confusing, but it'll make sense once we start going over them. So let's jump right in with the first type, the list variable. List variables are groups of items that are stored in order. The whole list can hold one subtype of data, strings, numbers, or booleans, but each item in the list can be accessed at any time, either by looping through every item in the list or by referencing its position in the list. That means that you can tell A360 that you just want the second item in the list, or the last one, or any other one as long as you know its index number, which identifies where an item is in the list. There's a bit more to it than that, but we'll talk about that in the List 201 course later on in this track. The next compound variable type, the record variable, is very similar to the list variable, but has some notable differences. A record variable is basically like a whole row in a table or an Excel sheet, and just like lists, you can access each item in the record if you know which column of the row the item is in. The main difference between list variables and record variables is that a record variable can hold almost all of the other types of variables, and they don't all have to be the same type. That means you can have a record variable with a string in the first position, a credential in the second position, and a datetime variable in the third position. Record variables can even store other record variables, but the trade-off is that record variables are extremely limited when you compare them to lists in terms of what you can do with them. We'll talk more about that in the Record 201 course later on in this track. Another compound variable type that's related to the record variable is the table variable, also known as a data table variable. These data table variables are like spreadsheets in that they have several rows made up of record variables with the same number of columns. These data tables are so similar to Excel spreadsheets that there are even commands to put whole Excel sheets into a single data table variable. You can even save data table variables as Excel files or CSV files if you want to, which can make them really powerful. The problem is that they also have a lot of restrictions, so we won't be talking in detail about them until the Advanced Developer Learning track. Finally, the last variable type is the dictionary variable. Dictionary variables are a lot like list variables because they can hold strings, numbers, and booleans, but instead of being held in ordered positions, they have custom keys that allow you to access the values in the dictionary. We can understand this better by thinking about an actual dictionary. If you wanted to know what the definition of the word automate was, you would look for the word automate in bold in the dictionary. This word itself is the key, while the definition is the value. Dictionaries in A360 work the same way, in that you have many key value pairs stored within them. If you want to access a certain value, you just give it the key and it'll return the value to you. Dictionaries are actually much more complicated than they may seem at first, so we'll save that until the Advanced Developer track, but it's good to know that they exist. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about two other types of variables that aren't quite the same as the others we've mentioned so far: predefined variables and global values. Let's start with predefined variables. In A360, there are several variables that already exist within 3 different categories when you open up the RPA workspace and start working on a bot. There's the clipboard, which is whatever's stored in your computer's memory when you copy something with Control-C or other methods. There's predefined string variables, which hold things like tabs and new line characters used for formatting text. And then finally, there's system variables. These system variables include all sorts of things that are based off of your computer's settings and A360's configuration. For instance, there are date, month, day, and year variables that show the current date, month, day, or year, respectively. Then there are variables for how much RAM your computer has and how much of it's being used. The A360 variables can show the full control room path to the bot that's currently running, the URL for your control room, and more. These A360 system variables may not seem very useful now, but once we get to the support developer learning track and start automating the actual bot lifecycle itself, they're super helpful. The other special variable type is the global value, and this works a lot differently than any of the other variables we've mentioned so far. Up until now, we've been talking about variables that you typically can only define and use within the actual bot task you're currently in. Variables can be sent from one task to another, but they're completely dependent on your bot code. Global values are different because they're custom variables that are set up in the control room by your administrator, and they can be used in any bot in that control room. For instance, if your RPA program wants all bots to send an email at the end of the bot to 3 different people, they could set up a global value called email addresses and put the 3 email addresses in that global value. Then, every bot in the control room could use that email address's global value when they press F2 to insert a variable and select it from the global value list. If at some point one of these 3 people leaves the company and a new person takes their place, the administrator can update the email address's global value instead of having every developer change the emails in their bot. We'll get into global values a bit more in this learning track in a course on resiliency in bots, but in my opinion this is one of the best new features of A360, and it can really be a game changer when it comes to maintenance of code. And that's it. Now you should understand the concepts behind variables as well as how to use them. You should also know about the different types, predefined variables, and global values included with A360. Just remember that variables can hold different values over time, even within the same bot. So if your bot isn't acting how it's supposed to, use debug mode or throw a message box into your code so you can see what's happening with your different variables. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. For more RPA training, check out the next video here, or watch everything in order right here. Subscribe to my channel for updates on new content, and become a patron to get access to personalized RPA support. But until next time, I'm Jordan at Afterburner Automation, and I hope this helps you build better bots.